Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsline. We're joined today by George Cooke, Senior Lecturer at the University of Colombo, of course, on International Affairs. Thank you very much, George, for joining us on our program today. So first things first, Sri Lanka is in a very, very big economic crisis. In the middle of all of this, now we're in a hot spot geopolitically. I think for the longest time we've been in a hotspot geopolitically. I think that goes by, just being a part of this global village. But however, what is important here is how we manage the situation, especially between India, who is of course fondly referred to as the big brother of Sri Lanka, and of course China, who is one of the biggest creditors of Sri Lanka. Now, since the economic crisis hit, India has been vital for Sri Lanka. India offered up $4 billion of aid, no questions asked. China also is a vital part of Sri Lanka, as their role in the debt restructuring talks is crucial for how soon, or if at all, Sri Lanka would come out of this economic crisis. However, since the inherent friction between China and India is now pouring over to Sri Lanka, how do you see Sri Lanka responding, or how do you think Sri Lanka should respond in light of the current events that have been taking place?
Thank you very much for inviting me. First thing, Sri Lanka must never forget the proximity of India, our history with India. And I'm not talking about ancient history. I'm talking about post-independence history by going back 30, 40 years. We must learn from mistakes that have been made in the past. The more we make those mistakes, the more we're going to repeat them. We're also going to see repercussions from them. We saw that in the 80s when we decided to move closer to the United States. We saw the problems with the Soviet Union going into Afghanistan, the impact that had on us over here, a country which you might think is completely away from Afghanistan. But you saw the relationship with the United States, with Pakistan, with India, with Sri Lanka. We must learn from this past. If we are going forward, India is a country that is indispensable in our foreign policy. It's not a country that we can take for granted on one side. It's not a country that we can ignore either. This is a country that we are an independent country. We are a sovereign entity. But India is a very large player, not just in our region. India is a large player on the world stage. Last year, India is buying fuel from Russia. This year, India is going on a state visit to Washington. You see, it's not a situation where the Americans feel, okay, India is moving towards the Russians, we'll hands off them.
Ties.
We're not going to do that.
India is also the fifth largest economy now.
Absolutely. This is a country that is rising much higher on the power ladder on the world stage. And it's not a country that we can afford to play around with. We've got to be extremely cautious in our relations with India. The visits that we undertake to India, the level of representation in India, what we are trying to do with the entirety of the country. Sometimes we look at India through the prism of Tamil Nadu only. And India consists of so many states. What are we doing with all of these states? What are we doing with the central government? How are we engaging that much more? Last year, as you mentioned very rightly, India came on board to help us big time. India went to the extent of giving us the fuel, giving us the credit lines, going to the IMF and speaking on our behalf.
And I don't think quite people really think that far and kind of forecast what would have happened to Sri Lanka if India did not come to our aid as they did.
Other countries hesitated, right? But India came forward because India realized the problem was growing. And one of the biggest challenges India would face would be boatloads of people crossing over. India has seen that in the past. India has learned from India's mistakes. Why did India go to the IMF? Why did India try to push? Why did India want Sri Lanka to have some kind of foreign assistance coming on board? Because only so much India can do. India can't keep giving and giving and giving. They also need in their own country. They are not a superpower in a developed sense. They also have their own constraints, their own problems in their country. And this is where they did not want us to completely collapse, because if that happened, the problem would only grow for them. And they were very, very concerned about that. And sometimes we wonder whether we have forgotten that this year. This year, the discussion is very different with India. Now we're talking about the 13th Amendment. Now we're talking about Kachativu. Now we're talking about fishing. Can you see how the narrative is changing from year to year? We've forgotten what India did for us last year. And we are probably making a lot of mistakes in our relationship with India. Probably we can remove that word probably there, and we can say we are making mistakes in our relationship with India.
So how does China feature in all of this, George?
We have borrowed very heavily from China. If we ask China for a loan today, we're going to get it in a few days. China will do that. You can't at that point fault the giver. China is on a trajectory of their own. They're rising. They have a certain goal that they want to achieve. They've set centenary targets. They know where they're going. They know what they want to do. In that particular process, when they keep giving us, and if we don't know how to use it effectively, if we don't know how to make sure that we are going to get something profitable out of the investment that they're giving us, if we are going to siphon it off, if we are going to pocket it, it's not their fault. We can't then use that term debt trap diplomacy. I don't subscribe to that. You want the money, they give it, you don't use it properly, and they are not to blame. You are to blame. Why are we blaming them? Why are we subscribing to these terms that have been coined in other parts of the world and using that against China at that stage? This is where China has, everybody has some kind of reasoning. When you're helping a country...
An agenda.
An agenda. Absolutely. It's not for sympathy or love or altruism.
There's no free lunch, I believe, as the saying goes.
Absolutely. This is part of China's rise on the world stage. And China is not a developed country. Whilst being identified as a developing country, they are helping other developing countries. They are looking at the long term. They are trying to build goodwill. They are trying to build influence. That's natural. You've also got to remember, if we tell China, can you please write off our debt? Can you forgive our debt? There will be a stream of countries coming after them saying, do the same thing you did for Sri Lanka, do it for us too. So we've got to understand it from their perspective as well. We want the investment. We want the inflow. We want that injection of foreign finances. But then the repercussions with that, obviously, every action has some kind of reaction at that stage. How are we trying to mitigate that? Take whatever we are taking, but have a strategy of how we are going to use it. Let's get Hambantota, let's get the port, but we must have a strategy of how we are going to use it. The airport there, very good. We have an alternate airport now. How are we going to use it? We have a Lotus Tower. How are we going to use it? The port city is being developed. Wonderful. Are we attracting investors, or are we sitting back and saying, hopefully China will bring them? You can't then blame China if China brings Chinese investors in there. Can you see how we are very apathetic? We're just sitting back and hoping that they will deliver full-time. Hambantota, we're waiting for them to bring the ships. Mattala, we're hoping that they will land the planes. There's supposed to be facilities in there to repair planes as well. What are we doing with that? How are we marketing that? How are we branding that? How are we taking that on the world stage? Hambantota is much closer to the international shipping lines than Colombo is. How are we using that? What is the advantage we are taking out of the opportunity that we have? We are to blame here, Shalan. We are to blame here. In-house, we have got to get the house in order first. This is where, for our foreign policy to be effective, we must know what we want within our own country. If we don't strategize and do that internally, you can't expect others to do it for us. Very often we're sitting back hoping that Port City is a classic example of that. We are hoping that they're going to bring the investors in too. And they will in due course. But what are we doing in terms of going around the world and talking about this place called a port city and the fact that there are so many opportunities, so much that can be done? What are we trying to attract? Who are we trying to attract? Are we trying to attract anyone? I'm not aware of it. I hope it's being done by someone somewhere at some level, but it's not public knowledge. And there's a communication issue which we can talk about later there. But we really have to know what we want out of this situation. On this program, before I've said, when we want investment coming in, we don't mind what the investment is. You can bring a matchstick factory and we'll be like, oh, bring your dollars and come and invest it. Is it fitting into our overall overarching plan for development in this country?
But then, George, the question is, do we have an overarching plan?
We don't. That's the sad part.
So your point being that unless the country as a whole has an overarching policy, has an overarching plan, we cannot have a foreign policy if the country does not have one.
We can have a foreign policy, but it's not going to be effective. And because it's got to feed off a really good national policy. Your foreign policy needs to be representative of what you want to achieve within your country. During the time of the conflict, we had certain needs. We needed to buy ammunition, we needed goodwill from certain countries. Foreign policy was adjusted accordingly. In this post-conflict era, we need to be now thinking of the development phase. Leave the taking off part, the survival part that we are going through from last year. We need to ensure we have a problem. We know what the problems are. How are we using that? How are we making our entire network of high commissions and embassies out there sing off the same sheet? Are we reaching out into countries? Are we trying to attract as much investment to fit into a particular plan that we have in this country? First and foremost, you must draw up the plan here. We must then be able to attract that investment to fit into that plan. Now, those are things that we've done in the past. We've seen that happening. It's not impossible. These are things that can be done.
When has it really happened, George, in the past?
Look at, for example, the opening up of the economy. When you had the establishment of the free trade zones, these are models that were studied by other countries. China came and studied our free trade zone model. They want to know how we were doing it, what we were doing. They were quite fascinated with how this was happening. Ronald Reagan, in his statement when Jaya Jayawardena visits, he talks about the fact that he hopes Capitol Hill will take a leaf out of Sri Lanka and the free trade zones that have been established in the country. So even the Americans were looking at the free trade zones going, wow, okay, you've done something pretty effective. This is where we've had strategies, we've had plans, and we've brought in investment to fit into those. Where are we doing it today? And it's not just today, it's in the past several years. We have not been doing that.
According to your reading, George, when you say past several years, how much roughly do you think?
We're going back to probably the mid-90s onwards. Our focus has been on the conflict entirely. We saw some form of development taking place in the late 70s, early 80s. But then thereafter you have July 83 coming in. Sri Lanka's trajectory was completely changed at that point. We did not do enough to stop it. We did not do enough to check it. We have not held people accountable for it. And then things have been building up from there onwards. You've had issues taking place in the late 80s. We're coming into the 90s. We tried to salvage things during the Kumaratunga Kadirgama period. We then come into a very effective first term of Mahinda Rajapaksa, where things were balanced. You then come into the post-conflict scenario, where he wants investment, and the only country willing to come forward is China. Can't blame China at that point. China realizes there's opportunity, let's go in there. And things just continue to spiral out at that point. Obviously, there should have been a plan. The Lotus Tower is going to be used for much more than looking at Colombo. There should have been a much more, I'm sure there was. Where is that plan? Mattala was not built for a storage facility. We should never have used it for that. We must, once the infrastructure is there, it is there. China is not going to lift the highways and take them back, or lift the port and take it back. It's tangibly here. What are we doing to use it? We have the infrastructure. Why aren't we using it? We have that massive convention center in Hambantota. Shouldn't we be targeting things around it? Where is the strategy? It's not a case of I built it and you won't use it, or you built it and I won't use it. It's Sri Lankan. That's what we mustn't forget. We must put aside this party and individual and our concerns and our requests and our requirements and think of the country for a change. We are always looking at people and identifying them as being pro this country or pro some other country or anti some other country. Where's the pro Sri Lankan? Where's the people thinking Sri Lanka first? Let's put our country forward. Where are those people?
George, now concerns have been raised from at least our Indian side regarding Sri Lanka's relationship with China and the several visits that China is making, and concerns especially that are raised by India, of course, go to the core of Indian interest, which is Indian national security. At least that's what they say. Are these concerns ill-founded? Is there something behind these concerns?
Ill-founded or not, we've got to realize if India raises a concern, there's a reason for them to raise the concern. We cannot disregard it. At that point, we need to, Shalan, be on a very good wicket with Delhi and with Beijing. We must do that. It's not a case of playing one against the other, using one against the other. That's not our business. We should never ever do that. We must have a good line to Beijing and a very strong line to Delhi. We must be able to sit down behind closed doors, explain, if you send this vessel, we're going to have repercussions. Explain to the other side, if we don't allow this vessel, we're going to have repercussions. Please understand our plight. We are a small country. Don't let this happen to us. We must be able to reach out to those countries. Are we reaching out to those countries? We are not doing that. We wait for them to come here. Some years ago, when the fertilizer issue came up with China, we waited till the Chinese foreign minister came here to sort it out. Who are we? We're the small party here. We're waiting for them to reach out to us and say, okay, you come here and sort it out. When it comes to countries like India, we're waiting for them to reach out to us. That shouldn't be the case.
Do you think it's intentional? As in, do you think the top brass, of course, that the responsible authorities are of that egoistic opinion, saying if you want to sort out an issue, you come down to us? Or is it merely oversight, or maybe a little bit of a harsher term, incompetence?
Oversight, a bit too much of oversight is taking place. We can't allow that to happen. We have people in very senior positions who are very experienced, who know this subject very well. Where is that experience? We cannot just sit back, and I'm talking about the bureaucracy here. You cannot sit back and hope that a leader, whoever it may be at whatever level, is going to know everything on the subject. If you have expertise, if you have a narrative in order to explain to them, you must be able to do that. If you are going to sit back and say, yes, whatever you say, I will do it, that is my bidding, the country is in a very sorry state at that point. We've got to have people at the top there who are going to be able to caution, explain the other side, explain what the consequences are, what the repercussions are. You might have a very good idea, but I must be able to talk to you and tell you.
But George, the real question here is, do we have an idea of the repercussions?
I'm sure we do. I'm sure we do. It's not like we're dumb. It's not like we don't know these things. We are not a new country. People who are at the helm are not newcomers. Some are. A lot aren't. Where's that experience? You didn't come into power yesterday. You did not come into politics yesterday. You did not join the bureaucracy yesterday. You have not only served in Colombo. You have experience around the world. You have engaged around the world. It seems to count for nothing. And that shouldn't be the case. When we go out there, what we see, what we learn, we're supposed to bring back. We don't come and emulate the same thing here, but we must know that there are other options, other things we can do, how we should go about doing it. That is something that we don't do sometimes. And that is what is really holding us back. We have a very, very narrow, blinded vision in terms of looking at what is going on. We're not looking at the full scope. Look at the countries that we focus on very, very heavily. There are 3 or 4 countries that are the main focus areas. What about countries in ASEAN? What about countries in the Far East? What about countries in West Asia? What about countries in South America? What about other European countries? What about countries in Africa? Do they not exist on the map? They do. Why are we giving them, I won't use the word cold shoulder, but why are we not giving them equal attention? Why aren't we looking for potential and opportunity there? They might not deliver the same amount of money that you are getting from a particular country, but they're going to give you something. They just want you to come and ask. They want you to attract the investors. They want you to come and say, we want the investment. Can you give it to us? Can you bring your investors? Can you send your tourists to us? Can we have a special arrangement? Are you going to support us in our tourism drive in those countries? You go to China, Shalan, and in some of the subways, you have massive advertisements for the Maldives. The Maldives government has not paid for those. That is China's way of supporting Maldives. There are other repercussions to that. You've got to, there's a degree of influence that's going to come with that. But you have those opportunities in those countries. Why can't we reach out to these countries?
I mean, having not reached out, we already have enough influence in the country, so what's the difference?
We really need to rethink who we're dealing with, look at historic ties, understand what the past has been, understand our old NAM connections. NAM countries, NAM is not as effective as it was, NAM is not at its peak, NAM is floundering, that's a different matter. But the bonds that we have in NAM, we haven't forgotten them. When you reach out to NAM countries and ask for support, their first question is, where do we sign? How can we support you? But why do we not turn to them? We do turn to them when there's an issue, when we want a resolution passed or a resolution opposed. Then we talk to them. That is sheer opportunism. You don't go behind someone. Imagine if you're in a classroom and you don't talk to other people. One day someone comes and talks to you, you're going to wonder, what does this person want now? They ignored me all this time. It's the same thing on the international stage. Other countries are doing that to us too. We're not the only ones. There are several countries who are very opportunistic in that way. But that's not an effective foreign policy. It has to be continuous. It has to be continuous engagement. This has been discussed for centuries. It cannot be short-term opportunistic advances. It has to be long-term. That is the only way you're going to get goodwill, build that goodwill, have strength, irrespective of what happens within the country. You can go through anything within the country. You have a steadfast network out there that will come to your rescue, that will help you. That is what we need to return to. That is what we need to focus on.
But one of the main issues, is, as far as at least Sri Lanka foreign policy is concerned, you get one government coming in, building goodwill with another country, bringing in investment at a huge advantage towards Sri Lanka, and then you get the government that comes immediately after that. They make a case that this is a very bad investment, this is unsound investment, unsustainable investment, and they scrap those projects off. Best example being the light rail project.
This is where the bureaucracy has to be much stronger. The bureaucracy, whichever government comes or goes, yes, secretaries of ministries change with the change of a government, but those within the system must be able to reach out without being overly concerned about you losing your perks or positions. You're doing it for the country. When you speak out, when you express your opinions, what are they going to do to you? Are they going to shoot you? No, they're not. They're going to listen to you. Some will be very receptive. Some will appreciate your sincerity because you're cautioning them. You're not in a very rude manner threatening them. You explain and say, if you do this, is the consequence. Be very careful of this. Be very cautious. This is the past. This is what has happened. You have to make the call, but I just want you to know what the consequences are. If I don't tell you that, you are making an ill-informed decision. You do not have all the facts with you. That is the problem that we have in this country right now. We are not willing to go that extra mile to explain to people in positions of leadership what the consequences are. A person before an election, day of the election, day after the election, same. Knowledge does not change. You don't get the people's knowledge through their vote. You are the same individual. You need a very good, very strong, sound team around you. You must also have the capacity to select that team. But once you have done that, your team must be able to deliver. The bureaucracy must be strengthened. The bureaucracy must come out in a much stronger way. Look at how it is happening in India. Look at how it is happening in so many other countries out there. The leader will make the final choice, but your conscience is clear. You have explained the consequences and the repercussions of action that is taken. Japan is a very, very good example. When we look at what transpired with Japan, countries in East Asia, very sensitive countries. You do not offend. If you offend, they will never forget it. Japan does not forget what we did for them in 51. Shalin, we did not give them money. We did not give them investment. We only made a statement. They will never forget that statement. They teach it to their children. That is how appreciative they are of what we did in San Francisco for them in 51. See how sensitive they are. Look at China. We signed the rubber ice pact with them when no one else was selling them rubber because of the embargo, North Korea and China. This is the first agreement between a communist and non-communist country. China appreciates that. China remembers that. In 2014, when the Chinese president visited, they wanted family members of R.G. Senanayake invited for the Chinese president to acknowledge their presence once again. 1952, 2014. How many years later? R.G. Senanayake, who signed the Rubber Ice Pact, is gone. His son is not around. It's his daughter-in-law and grandson who were invited. Why is China doing that? Those are lessons that we must learn. We must not forget. Here we are forgetting our own history. We are forgetting what happened last week. These countries remember what happened decades ago, and they are still appreciative of it. Look at how much we have to learn.
Is the forgetfulness, is it an inherent quality of being Sri Lankan?
Probably it is. Probably it is. It is becoming very much a part and parcel of the psyche of being Sri Lankan, which is very bad. We must stop it immediately. We must break this pattern. These countries will... The monorail is a classic example. A few weeks ago, you had the Japanese foreign minister coming on a visit. Japan is trying to extend an olive branch, trying to reach out, trying to mend the relationship to some extent.
Because they still remember.
They still remember. But we've got to be proactive. We can't hope that all these major players on the world stage will reach out to us. We are not the center of the universe. We are another country in the world. If they can't use our port, there are plenty of other ports to use. If they can't use our location, there are plenty of other locations to use. We are not in the middle. We sit in Colombo and we think that. The moment we go into the world, we realize that we are another cog in the wheel. We are not the most important one.
Quite a small cog in there.
A small cog. We must be very practical here. That doesn't mean we downplay our potential, downplay what we have done. We have gone on to chair the Security Council of the United Nations. Have we ever tried to get into the Security Council after that? Why? Oh, let's dodge the bullets. Let's not try to go into the big boys arena. We are small. You see how we pull ourselves back? We've played a much bigger role on the world stage. Yes, several factors have happened where we've got to rethink how we put ourselves out there, how we expose ourselves, because we are prone to attack. That is something that we are seeing happening. But we must also realize that first we must know our history, we must know what we have done, we must know where it's coming from, and we must know what we can achieve out of it by strategizing for the future. If we don't plan now, the next 10, 20 years are going to be the same as it is today. Do we want that? We certainly don't. We don't want to see successive generations going through the same problems that we are going through, the same economic issues we are going through. We want this country to take off. When is it going to take off? The moment we start thinking Sri Lankan on one side, the moment we start having a national plan of action for the country, and we have a very effective foreign policy in order to have a superb network out there which is going to stand by us through thick and thin.
Thank you very much. I think quite a good note to end on, George, as we've run out of time on Newsline tonight. Thank you very much, George Cooke, Senior Lecturer at the University of Colombo, of course, on International Affairs, for joining us on our program. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.